In the second essential task of Unit 2, we will begin talking about creativity, one of the very first concepts that falls under the umbrella of cognition. As we established yesterday, the expectation is that this essential task and this concept map can be held horizontal or vertical, as the H or V indicates. And unlike yesterday's concept map, I would like you to copy the entirety of the goal text. So everything that's written there in yellow, the entirety of the task. The essential task today from afar looks like this. We have a box here at the top indicated creativity, and then we have two columns, one labeled convergent thinking and the other labeled divergent thinking, with a box down here at the bottom. So there are 4 total boxes in today's concept map. This is the very first time that we've encountered a concept map that has this 2-columned division, as you see in front of you. This will be a format that you will become very used to as the year progresses. But due to the length of these boxes, I think you could very easily hold a piece of paper, horizontal or vertical, in order to achieve this concept map. Creativity might seem like an unusual word to define. It's a word that we use quite often. However, it does have a very specific definition. And if you miss the very key element of novel ideas, your cultural expectation of the word might not necessarily match the psychology definition. When we define something as being creative, whether that's an idea or anything of the like, we're talking about something that's considered valuable, whether it's by a group of scientists, whether it's by customers, whether it's by the community at large, but then also something that is novel or new. So, for example, if you had a new novel idea for a product, but the product wasn't valuable, antiquated, people don't have interest in it, although it's unique, although others may not have thought of it, if it's not considered valuable, it's really not going to be considered creative. For something to be considered creative, it needs to be a new idea that's also valuable. Think about the first individual that spawned social media, or the first individual that thought of Uber or Lyft or those type of car services. Those ideas were considered valuable. Clearly, in 2020, those are very valuable services. And at one point, they were considered new ideas. Creativity is an unusual concept in the sense that it's not evaluated by any specific test. Creativity can be a bit subjective. So, for example, we are going to identify 2 terms that are very closely related to creativity and relate back to the idea of, if I gave you a brick, what would you be doing with it? What would you be inclined to do with it? Some of you might end up classifying yourselves as a convergent thinker, while others might identify as a divergent thinker. So now we are going to progress to the 2-column division that you see here on the concept map. The column on the left has a box below, so make sure to leave some space on your piece of paper to include not only the convergent thinking box, but also the box below. The term convergent thinking is a term that we use for an individual who exhibits the process of focusing in on the single best solution to a problem or an issue that they are facing. They'll look at the possible available solutions, but they'll be very tunnel vision, very single-minded, all to the best solution. So if you were given a brick, somebody who is a convergent thinker would think about very practical things that you could build. They would think about roads and walls and fences, maybe a well, things that are very obvious, clear-cut, straight to the point. And there's really nothing wrong with expressing convergent thinking. In many circumstances, just focusing on the most practical, really in most cases universally considered the best solution, it's probably going to save you a lot of time and hassle trying to go through a bunch of solutions and ideas that might not necessarily be as obvious or practical. The letter M that we encountered yesterday stood for memory trick, or as we will soon define, mnemonic. This blue letter M will be seen again throughout many of the boxes throughout this year. This is a very simple mnemonic, so that when you see the word convergent, you perhaps can relate it to this very simple definition, and in doing so, walk away with a better understanding of the word convergent thinking. When I look at the word convergent, I see the word converge, which means, by definition, to come together. And with that in mind, I like to think of this visual. You do not have to include this visual in your concept map. Often there are visuals like this that I provide. All means, if you have space and want to, you can draw your own version of this. But this is what I envision when I think of a convergent thinker. A convergent thinker is very practical. They're going to focus on the available facts and the information around them and just focus in on a single, obvious, practical, best solution. They're going to converge on that single best solution. So when I look at this visual, it really, to me, captures the concept of converging onto one space or onto one idea. The next two terms are what we call prototype, and then directly related to prototype is a concept that we call schema. We are first going to reference these two terms here in Essential Task 1-2. We will reference them again when we talk about decision making later in this unit, and then again when we get to Unit 9, Developmental Psychology. I'm actually going to start backwards. I'm going to start by describing and explaining schema, and then I'm going to work my way to the word prototype. For schema is the framework of any given topic, which seems like an unusual definition, so I'll give you some examples. If I asked you to identify all of the framework associations that you have with tables, you might give me things like made of wood, things that you eat at, 4 legs, probably a square or rectangle. Maybe you might even consider situations where there are tables, like in lunchrooms or poker tables. All of those various characteristics all around that given topic of tables is an example of your schema. Another example of schema. If I asked you to identify all of the things that come to mind when I say college, this might differ from student to student, but some of you at home are probably thinking in-state. Some of you might be thinking very much out of state. Some of you might be thinking about parties. Some of you might be thinking about college sports. Some of you might be thinking about education. Some of you might be thinking about unique aspects of the major that you are considering. Maybe if you're considering a science major, you're thinking about labs. Maybe you're thinking about the workstations that you're going to experience. Maybe if you're going to school for business, you have economic ideas that come to mind. Schema can be a term that's very individual. Going up and talking about the word prototype, your prototype is the absolute best representation of your given schema for a certain concept. So, for example, when I ask you about your individual schema for college, if you were to list all of the characteristics and I asked you to match all of those characteristics up with the number one college that satisfies as many of those as possible, what would it be? For me, it might be UMass Lowell. That's where I went. I am a UMass Lowell alumni. That's where I went for undergrad and grad school. When I was your age and thinking about where I wanted to go to college, the characteristics that I considered were in-state, relatively cheap, would be able to commute. I grew up about an hour and a half from Apponequet, so I grew up much closer to UMass Lowell than you currently live, only about 20 minutes away. I was looking for an education program. I was looking for a history program. I was also more specifically looking for a 5-year master's program so that after I finished my undergrad, I could spend an additional year at college to get my master's degree. So UMass Lowell really fit all of the criteria that I was looking for, and for me individually was my prototype college. It was the best example of the characteristics for my schema of college. Schema can be used for tables, colleges. I might ask you about pizza, and you can list all of the criteria that come to mind when you think of pizza, whether that's thin crust, whether that's Sicilian pizza, whether that's deep dish pizza, whether or not you want toppings on it, bacon, pepperoni, pineapple, whatever it might be. Whatever the characteristics are, individually, for a given concept is what's called your schema. And then if you match your schema up with the absolute best example, you've talked about prototype. The final box in today's concept map is labeled as divergent thinking. To zoom out a little bit more so you can fully prepare your concept map, we just finished creativity and this left column here. We are now going to proceed to divergent thinking. It's the final column here on the right. A divergent thinker expresses their creativity quite a bit differently. As a matter of fact, creativity would be most exemplified through examples of divergent thinking. Instead of focusing on the most practical, obvious idea, a divergent thinker is willing to think a little bit more outside the box. A divergent thinker is not going to look at a brick and just simply build a well or build a chimney. They're going to think of other unique things that are a little bit more outside the box, like maybe a candle holder, as perhaps you can see here in this picture. This looks a little bit dangerous, but perhaps you can hold light bulbs in bricks. Those are examples of what you might consider divergent thinking. That would be an individual who looks at the brick and doesn't just go to the most practical solution. They think about many possible solutions, which would certainly be a great example of creativity. The concept map, Essential Task 1-2, ends briefly here by talking about the word diverge. It's a word that you've probably seen before, to go into a different direction. Or if you identify just the DI at the beginning of diverge, that means two. Whether you think about the word diverge or the word die, In either circumstance, we're talking about multiple directions or multiple solutions, which is precisely what differentiates convergent thinking, converging onto the most obvious and practical, versus diverging into many different solutions and perhaps offering many creative solutions as a result. But that concludes Essential Task 1, 2 in creativity. In this essential task, we talked about the difference between convergent and divergent thinking, and also defined the terms schema and prototype.